Thank you. I'm extremely honored to be here. And I would like to thank my friends for printing and discovering the practical use of a 3D printer with a Black Swan being printed by my friends here. However, I'll make a comment. I think it'd be a little more difficult to print something called Uncertainty, the title of the Incerto collection. So, but I'm certain they'll find a way to print something called Uncertainty once you can visualize it. But I guess we're a few centuries away from visualizing something called Uncertainty. So I'm introducing myself here. My origin is trader, because a lot of people think I'm a professor, or a lot of people think I'm a writer, so I give a little bit of so that's my national origin. I was a trader doing these kind of weird things. And then I got downgraded myself to becoming a pit trader. Those people who, stand in a pit, sweat a lot. The smell is not conveyed by the picture, but you can understand. And you spend 6 hours on your feet. I did that from quantitative trader, for the experience, and I fell in love with markets, how prices develop. Price formation is a very difficult thing. I still don't understand it. Then it was so difficult trading in a pit that I went to do this for retirement, largely because I can't do tennis, so this was easier. So I became a professor at NYU and focusing on things. So it's pretty much backwards. So I went from practice, sorry, this doesn't go backwards? No, this doesn't go backwards. Yeah, it does. So I went from practice to theory, rather than go from theory to practice, which means that you make enemies in theory and you make enemies in practice, because you don't have the same culture in both. And now this is the Technical Incerto I'm embarking on, and the first volume is out. It's on something we'll discuss during the fireside chat. But the first volume is about fat tails, how most of history comes from random events that are very consequential, and in an environment that I call scalable. And I've discovered yesterday, visiting my friends, that this becomes scalable. Whatever was limited to artisanal production becomes scalable. I mean, surgery is not scalable yet. A surgeon, the best surgeon in the world, cannot see 1 million people in a day. But an author, you write a book once and that's it. Luckily, you can I'm very lazy, so it's great. You write a book, every time someone buys it, you don't have to rewrite it. You see, unlike surgery or other professions. But thanks to this, a lot of professions are becoming scalable. Even dentistry. I mean, you can make 1 million teeth, all right? You don't have to be there except for the first one. Anyway, so that was the first block of research, fat tails, what I call fat tails extreme events, on which later. Now, let's talk about fragility. So before we talk about robustness, resilience, stuff like that, we need to define fragility. And so, again, I mean, I went into research because I was incompetent in anything else, outside trading. So I couldn't play tennis. So the first thing I realized, looking at a coffee cup, is that we had a definition of fragility. I was an option trader, trading volatility. And I realized there were packages that like volatility and packages that hate volatility. The same thing was right there staring at me. Look, I mean, the coffee cup I was looking at, I'm lying, was not as attractive as this one. It was an ugly coffee cup. Not Starbucks, but an ugly coffee cup. Anyway, so I realized that it did not like volatility. So here we have the definition of fragility, and from there we can figure out antifragility. If you're fragile to some classes of events, you can have the reverse reaction to them. You can gain from shocks. So my definition of fragility came with this don't know, is this is fragile. So with the following very simple thing, everything fragile on this planet must have acceleration of harm. And this, I figured it out from trading. Like if the market goes down 1%, so I'm removing this so people don't read the slide. So if the market is down 1%, say you lose $1 million, down 2%, you lose another $5 million. So there is acceleration, and that acceleration is quite universal. And that applies to us. If we jump 10 meters, we die. 10 meters is a lot worse than 10 times 1 meter. And why is this necessary? Because if you're linear to harm, okay, if you're linear to harm, just walking from here to the whatever would kill you because a lot of shocks. So we're sort of insensitive to small shocks, then we get disproportionately more sensitive to others because everything that's linear to harm is already gone. So everything fragile is going to be nonlinear to harm. And we're going to see everything antifragile will be nonlinear to harm, and everything I'm going to be talking about for the rest of my life is based on that very simple point. So this is the coffee cup. It is nonlinear to harm because I tap on a coffee cup, it doesn't break, doesn't break, doesn't break. Then a little more, it breaks. And we're going to see why averages don't matter anymore, and many things that come with the idea. So second order effects is effectively what we got to concentrate on. And you can see that really with the pandemic, okay? The supply chain, second order effect is when, I put some equations here just to wake people up, and let me remove and put pictures. So second order effect, you can see it easily. Don't cross the river is on average 4 feet deep. And translate it into French, it's a convex function of an average or whatever. So you can also translate it into Russian, where it's even more theoretical. So that's what I call convexity effect. But you can see it with the supply chain story. If you consume 0 for 1 year and 200 units the second year, it's going to be a lot worse than if you consume 100 the first year and 100 the second year. So we have we can figure it out if the market causes fragility or not in some domains. Okay? Unevenness, you want steadiness. We are fragile to temperature. For example, I'd rather have 70 degrees today and 70 degrees tomorrow rather than 0 degrees today. We're not close to it, but it feels like it, all right? Sort of like today in Boston, all right? Anyway, 0 degrees today and 140 tomorrow. You see the idea. So whatever is fragile depends heavily on second order effect. And that's quite universal. So I'm taking this, of course, you know, in 40 minutes I'm not going to be able to cover a lot, but I'm going to take this as an interesting territory, is that size causes fragilities. And it was a very simple example, a large stone. If someone threw this at my head, you know, you'd have to, someone else to replace, you need someone else to replace me for the continuation of the session because I won't be here. But if you took the big thing, the big rock and broke it into pebbles and threw them progressively at my head, nothing would happen. So you see there is a size effect. And pretty much everything in finance, everything that breaks, bankruptcies, all of these come from acceleration of harm. Because if you're very sensitive to harm in the beginning, it would show. So it has to be hidden, harm has to be hidden, and then accelerate. Just like if you smash a car against the wall 1,000 times at 1/10 of a kilometer per hour, nothing's going to happen. But once at 1,000 kilometers per hour, you know what's going to happen, right? So this is that acceleration. And you can see very easily this can explain why an elephant is very fragile. If you push an elephant, I mean, I'm not inviting you, it's a thought experiment to push an elephant. But if you push an elephant off this stage, it would break a leg. Now, again, I'm not inviting you to push elephants off the stage, it's a thought experiment. And when elephants break a leg, they're gone. This is why we don't have a lot of elephants. They're vastly more efficient than a mouse, metabolically, heart rate 50 versus 200. But guess what? A mouse, you can throw a mouse, it won't even notice. It will laugh at you, all right? So if you throw a mouse off the stage or something, many times it's height. So there is an effect of diseconomies of scale that comes with fragility because of that nonlinearity. And that's also universal. We have, I don't know about Boston, but in New York we have at least 8 million mice. Nobody counted them, so you can imagine, because they don't vote, it's not precise. But you can imagine, and we don't have a lot of elephants, all right? So that explains why small companies tend to survive shocks a lot better than large companies, particularly when there are squeezes. So all of this now, hopefully I'll confuse you a little bit in the next 2, 3 slides, is linked to options, because options have nonlinear payoff. And whatever has this optionality likes volatility and likes uncertainty for some weird reason. And then we look at fragility as an inverse of that. The other side of the coin is the fragile. And basically, I'm going to confuse you one more time and then it becomes easy, all right? If you like one of these, you like them all. So if you like, and let me explain how. If you like uncertainty, you will like time. Why? Time brings uncertainty. You see, with time, if the coffee cup, there's no coffee cup here, but if we had a coffee cup on the table, you know that over time it's going to break because you're going to have an earthquake or something, okay? So time, uncertainty, shocks, stressors, entropy, all of these go in the same direction. If you like one, you like them all. This is why I call them the soda brothers, like like the brothers that move, furniture in New York City. Is the name, so the soda brothers. So it took me 10 years to really formalize this idea that if you like one, you like them all, and you realize, and we can multiply the examples, but what is convex is what likes variability. A very simple example of what is convex is what you'd rather have for lung. People don't know that for lung ventilators, particularly during COVID, it's something that people didn't pick up on immediately. If you give the patient 100% of the dose all the time, the patient dies. If you give the patient 80% and 120% of the needed dose, the average dose, guess what? They do a lot better. Boosts the survival. So you are convex. And concave means the average, okay, is better than the outcome. And basically, that's pretty much what it is, all right? So convex, sorry, no, I can't go back. Concave, all right? That's the best way to know it. Convex means you have an acceleration in your favor, okay? Concave, an acceleration against you. That's sort of like the general idea. And we'll have illustration. And basically, if you're concave to randomness, to harm, to anything, you won't do very well in the long run. Another example, this here, sitting on a table, if you put it on a table for a year, we'll experience about, what, 500,000 to 1 million small earthquakes. No effect. One large earthquake and it will break. So this is, if you have accelerated harm, basically concave is accelerated harm. So, and here I'll show, it shows in medicine, where you can have, everything in nature has an S-curve, where you start by being convex, and then end up being concave. Like, for example, your frequency of meals. It's a lot better to have, if you develop diabetes from too frequent meals, to have, say, 1 meal a day than 18 meals a day for the same average. But it's a lot better to have 1 meal a day than for 18 days, okay, rather than 0 meals and then 18 meals in 1 day. you see? So the thing is there's an S-curve where we are convex in the beginning and then concave later. When you're convex, you want unevenness for that segment. And when you're concave, you want steadiness. So coffee cup wants steadiness. Some things like unevenness. We're going to see businesses, good businesses, like unevenness, chaos, turmoil, and they're all convex. So to repeat, why is this connected to an option? Because, again, I was a trader. An option you have is convex. You gain more from the upside than you lose on the downside. Say if the market goes up 1%, I make X. If it goes down 1%, I lose maybe half of X. An entrepreneur, you come up with an idea, we're going to see how you tinker. Okay, you make $1 million if you're right, and you lose 10,000 if you're wrong. That's convex. If you make more, if you're right, for an equivalent thing, you are convex. Okay? So this is up to a zone. Okay? And effectively, there's something I proved that everything that has a floor would be convex at the floor. And everything that has a ceiling would be concave around the ceiling. And that applies to nutrition, to anything. Okay? And so a lot of people are working on this in oncology. I mean, a lot of people, a few people. I mean, say a few people are working on this in oncology, dose response, because everything follows, as I said, in nature, in S-curve. In biology and medicine, they model it under some form or another. Now I spoke about fragility, and effectively there's no word to express the opposite of fragility. Because if you say, ask someone, there's actually a package out the door with fragile written on it. But if you ask someone the opposite of fragile, they tell you robust or resilient. No, it doesn't get better from shocks, the robust. The robust just like wants, you know, well, it's like people in Brooklyn. They don't care, all right? You hit it on them, they're tough, all right? They're like, don't get better, they don't get worse, all right? So they're not, so there got to be that property that's the exactly mirror image of the fragile that has to have some accelerated, and this is hidden in many things, and I just tried to express it, to make it clear in the book Antifragile, and it took about a long time for people to understand that it was not the same as robust. And so let's talk about antifragility. Well, I'm sure that you're familiar with this concept of a gym. Now, why do we go to a gym? Because it looks like our body needs stressors. You know, why do you have a sauna? Well, because you need some thermal stressor, all right? Moderate stressor. And effectively, to figure out why there is convexity in exercise, okay, running, if you run 100 meters in, say, 12 seconds, you do better than if you do it over an hour. You see? Or another example, if you go to the gym, what's better, to lift 1,000 times something of a few ounces, or lift once something of 1,000 ounces? What's better, to lift 100 times something of 1 kilo, or 1 time something of 100 kilo? Depending on where we are on the curve in fitness, visibly, there is a point where it's better, and there's an S-curve. You are convex in the sense that you gain more from lifting 5 times or 10 times something heavy, rather than 1,000 times something light. So there is an acceleration. So when I wrote Antifragile, heart rate variability was still not popular. And actually, I wasn't aware of it, but you would ask cardiologists at the time, you know, is it good for the heart to have steady, you know, to have a steady frequency between intervals? And they say, yes, it's very important to have a steady pulse. Well, it turned out the best predictive of death is, guess what? A steady pulse. And it turned out, and now they have heart rate variability. I have it on my Apple Watch, all right? When I wrote Antifragile 15 years ago, published 10 years ago, on my Apple Watch has heart rate variability. It wants me to have non-steady heart, okay? Well, up to a point. So this property, but guess what? What is the best predictor of a company's bankruptcy? The single best predictor for companies that have been around, say, for which you have time series of 5 or 10 years. Low variance of earnings. And actually even more, low variance of cash flows, because earnings can be manipulated. That low variance of cash flow is a predictor of the death of a company. And we actually had plenty of data for funds. Hedge funds that have no volatility usually go bust. In 2009, that was the best predictor of the bankruptcy of a fund. So, and we're going to see why having some volatility in the system is important. And the thing comes from a property that we humans have, and that's a question I put as a title of a chapter on the main difference between a cat and a washing machine, on the main difference between something organic or something alive and something engineered. The problem I had already with my books is that most people, the Black Swan had sold millions of copies and was commented on by people who just looked at the chapter headings and thought they could understand it from the chapter heading. So I made sure none of my chapter headings could explain anything in Antifragile, right? So, and the central one is on the main difference between the cat and the washing machine. And what is it? Is that everything organic requires stressors. If you're antifragile, it's not trivial. You require stressors to function properly. Without stressors, you wane. But you know what would happen to you if you don't subject your bones to stressors? Say someone from Boston invited you to go on a space shuttle, all right? And spend some time. So there's still some Russians up there you can engage in politics, okay? So say you spend 6 months up there. What would happen to your bone density when you came back to Earth? When you come back to Earth? Okay, so visibly, everything organic communicates with the environment via stressors. So I have a Mediterranean complexion, so I gain protective, tanning. I was hiking for 4 days. So I tanned. Why? Because my body is protecting me, predicts more. So I communicates with the environment, not because my brain decides, hey, let's stand because to be protected. No, because the stressor causes a reaction. I get stronger from a stressor bearing weights. Okay, my bones get stronger from the stressors of pounding, okay, or gravity. So the thing about the cat, if you don't abuse your cat, please. But if you put the cat in make it idle, it's get weaker. But the washing machine doesn't have that problem. So as a matter of fact, if you go bang with your wrist on a washing machine, your bone will get stronger. Okay, don't go too hard because you can break something and don't blame me. But try, and the washing machine will not get better. So that's one main property of systems. So when I left trading, traders speak an opaque language. Nobody understands it. Even traders don't understand traders. So there's no unique language. So when I left trading, I realized there was no clear language to describe risk. So most people think, and in financial theories, a lot of people in Boston here, Harvard Business Schools, have bad ideas, where for them, risk is low variability. And as you can see from the heart, from a lot of things, have nothing to do with low variability. You have to make a difference, the central mistake between risk and variability. Risk is in a tail for large events. Bankruptcy is a risk. But variability doesn't predict that risk. And very often for a human body, for a heart, for a lot of things, it's the opposite. So that's a big mistake. And effectively, I was subjected to the war in Lebanon. And I came out of it, everybody would ask me about my trauma. What do you mean trauma? I was a kid during the war, and it was terrible then. Trauma? No. Well, it turned out it's not universal for people to get trauma for war, but there's something, the opposite that I discovered, that, of course, people get trauma, there's post-traumatic disorder. But there's something vastly more frequent, called 10 times more frequent, called post-traumatic growth. If the trauma is not too strong, thing grows from it. It's just like anything, right? Like going to the gym. And guess what? Nobody talks about it. Why? Can someone tell me why? Because no clinical psychologist is ever going to make any money try to cure you of post-traumatic growth, right? They're not, you know, you're not going to have sessions to mitigate your post-traumatic gains, right? So this is why it's not studied. They're not going to make any money from it, selling you drugs for that, all right? So I mean, it doesn't mean that you have to subject your children to harm, but a moderate amount of stressors is needed. So now let's continue when things get stressors. There's a mechanism of upregulation. Upregulation, like you subject something to a stressor, it upregulates. Like your attention span, if the problem is a little more difficult, becomes a lot better. Like great horses, they lose races with bad horses, but they win against excellent horses. So they upregulate. It's well known. So there's, of course, the saying, when life gives you a lemon, you have two options in life. You have the defensive option. There's going to be storms, so you go in the basement and cry, maybe apply for some government grants, okay, or go on Twitter and complain, whatever it is. So that's one option one. Option two, you say, oh, is there going to be a problem? Let's make some money out of it. Okay. So that's the second option. Well, it turned out that it's a little beyond what I thought. Now, what is the best way for a country, particularly if it's maritime, to get rich? Okay, let me reverse it, all right? What is the worst possible way to enrich a country? Give it resources. The most successful countries in history typically are small city-states. Singapore today is probably the most successful country in modern history. I mean, except if you like to chew gum, I mean, you would share my opinion that it's a very well-run place. They don't even have water. They have nothing. They was thrown out of Malaysia. You see, the only country known to have been fired, okay? Usually it's like a reverse Putin. They say, you guys go away, all right? They had no resources, nothing. So they were forced to transform, but they had water around them, water into gold. So you give a country gold, they'll get poor. Exactly what happened to the Spaniards in Latin America. You give someone no resources, they upregulate. And effectively, I mean, I know well some Phoenician history, overcompensation, and how the city-states, Venice, they had no resources, so they had to go get resources. So what do you do? What did the Phoenicians do? They had nothing. They had the water. Well, they had to go to Cyprus because it was very fashionable then to use copper. You needed copper. Cyprus, named after copper, is where copper was. How do you go to Cyprus? Well, you need a boat. How do you make a boat? Well, you cut some wood. So they figured out how to make boats and how to cut wood to make palazzos. They built the temple. And then they figured out how to trade, because if you go to Cyprus, okay, and then you come back, you tell them, do you want some French fries with it or something? So, you come back with, so people started commercial networks simply because they had no resources. That's upregulation that come from stressors. And this is I tell you, this is very common from companies. We see it in the data, that unless companies have difficult periods, they don't grow. So there are a lot of ways, the chaos monkey also, to improve your system is by if the world doesn't stress your company out, you can do your own stressor. You know, you can hack your own system, for example. And then, of course, you can see what happened before and after the dot-com crisis. That's what I'm told. I'm told that before 2000 it was this, and after 2000, stop getting email, all right? Before, you know, so my nightmare is emails, because now social media. It's on social media, which is another nightmare, but not as bad. And then finally, let me explain. I said that if you like variability, you are convex. So evolution works by convexity, is antifragile. So you're antifragile up to a point. And let me explain how. Let's talk about that form of evolution that takes place outside bedrooms, you know, where it's called parthenogenesis, where virgin reproduction. It does exist in nature, where an organism reproduces itself. Okay, so you're going to have identical copies of yourself, would you? No. Once in a while, it's like in the old days when you send a fax machine with instructions and be a little blurred. So you have an error in printing. I'm sending to a 3D printer something with an error. Most of the time, the error is bad. Once in a while, the error is good. So you benefit from errors, and that's basically how evolution happens. It's errors, but guess what? You want to make some errors, not too many. Why? Because if you have too many errors, you undo the gains from previous errors. So there's a sweet spot where your optimal rate of errors, and that's pretty much what we have. We have mutations. The other thing happened with regular reproduction, where you have a lot of offspring. They're not the same, because they're random recombination from parents, and the ones that are better for the environment. So dispersion and variability works for you here as well. So error and variability are the same thing. And that's the antifragile. So the antifragile is not just something that you bang over on her or his head, their head gets stronger. It's something that benefits from the sort of cluster, and it's the same way. It's the same representation mathematically. So now let me explain how we probe uncertainty. Okay? Do you recognize this object? So now that I'm in Boston, I'm going to talk about what I used to call the Soviet Harvard delusion. All right? I'm sorry if the Soviet Harvard delusion, and let me talk about it now. This is commonly known as a wheel. It was discovered supposedly in Mesopotamia 6,000 years ago. Why did it take 6,000 years for this application? Those who are old enough here, I'm finding some gray and white hair, will know what I mean. Traveling with a suitcase, think of traveling with a suitcase without wheels. We did that for 6,000 years, including a large chunk of my adult life, particularly when I was a student, was 2 or 3 suitcases, right? So why did it take so long? Because we're not good at figuring out the future, not even what we have in hands. Like my friend Mike showed me something that we discovered accidentally, only because we were forced. This, okay, 3D printed, the thing that unpleasant stuff they give you before you know, sometimes going to work, you know, that very unpleasant. Okay, now it's in one piece. Well, they were forced to 3D print them because there was a shortage, and they discovered the idea that you can do it in one piece. Necessity is the mother of invention. Sort of, it's not. I mean, they never thought about it, making them all in one piece before. Anyway, so you can't probe uncertainty very easily. We're not good. Our imagination is not good. We're not good. The world is way too complex for us. Now, the story of the wheel is actually more vicious than what I just described. You recognize these objects from your last trip to Cancun, I guess, no? Or unless you don't do culture when you go to Cancun. These are the pyramids they built in the Mesoamericas at a time, all right? So they built these without the wheel. You know, it's very simple. They had a lot of corn maze, slaves. You get this, all right? You didn't need the wheel. Is it true they didn't have the wheel? Mexico City Museum, National Museum. They had the wheels, but they used them only for children's toys. They didn't even make the leap of using the wheels. So you realize we're not good at predicting the future. So we're better at doing, and the idea that being convex to uncertainty means having more to gain from tinkering, from these errors that make you do well, these random errors, only because you're convex. You have more to gain than to lose from them. And visibly, there are some industries that are error-loving. Pharma, as you can see, I'm sure nobody here has heard, but there's a drug so-called Viagra. Nobody has heard of it here, but you can Google later to see what it does. But it was not meant to be something to improve the lives of retirees and you know, who play golf, right? That was not the aim of Viagra. The aim was something else, but they discovered that, well, in the experiment that some part of the cohort, okay, was that didn't have the placebo appeared extremely happy, okay. So you make a lot of money. So pharma has worked with mistakes, and kept going with mistakes, thinking that that they went by. So the whole idea of design versus tinkering. So of course we need both science and tinkering, but my idea is that part of a lot of what we do is lecturing birds how to fly in science. What we do with our hands is so convex that the example I use is that I'd rather be anti-fragile than smart. And I think if your brain, assuming IQ worked, it doesn't. Assuming your head has 120 IQ points, your hands have 1,000. 1,000, okay? By tinkering, trial and error, and doing these things. So let me take stock and summarize and connect things. I've defined fragility. I defined antifragility. Remember, antifragility is not for everything. Like, for example, if you bang me on the head, or if I jump 10 centimeters, my bone gets stronger. But if I jump 10 meters, the only bones that get stronger is those of the people carrying my coffin, all right? So you realize it's up to a point. You have starvation up to X hours is okay, but if you starve for 2 years, you know, it's not excellent. I mean, I don't know, you can try, but I predict that it's not gonna be very good, okay? So it's up to a point. It's embedded in natural things. And now, hopefully, during the discussion, we're going to talk about how, I discovered yesterday that 3D printing removes some fragilities. How does it remove some fragilities? Well, anything optimized is fragile, okay? So to counter that, typically you need redundancies. You need to have 18 different suppliers or whatever. Some number of suppliers, make sure they're not in the same time zone, they don't speak the same language, they don't have the same culture, so they won't have revolution at the same time, all right? But if you have a backup option to circumvent that with an insurance, to be able to print your way out of a shortage, then you're not as fragile. It's not much more difficult than that, okay? And I didn't think about it before. I had no idea about 3D printing, that you can print this beautiful object, and you can sell it to me and tell me it was made by a very, very, very fancy artisan. I would have bought the story anyway. So thank you for listening to me, and I'm honored to be here.
Great talk. All right, so I'm going to channel everyone's questions back to Nassim here, and we can have a little discussion about this. I'm glad you summarized at the end, because I was taking away from this that I'm supposed to be a mouse that goes to the gym and seek out trauma.
Yes.
Seeking out trauma. I love the PS, post-traumatic growth
you like the idea.
syndrome too. I'm going to use that one. So
but don't go to Ukraine. Don't go to Ukraine, though.
Right. So, I love that also you brought this back to 3D printing at the end, and more lessons here for this group. We do have a mixture in the crowd of startups that perhaps are more nimble or designed to be more nimble, but we also have the bigger companies in the audience that maybe we could talk a little bit more about the fat tail syndrome that you talked about at the beginning, and how that kind of what the lessons are for the bigger companies and fragility, and what accrues to concentration around the fat tails.
Okay, so let me explain the tail story, which is pretty much the theme of the Black Swan, that there are two kinds of environments. Let's not try to figure out events. Let's try to figure out the type of environment we're in. Let's say that I gather 1,000 people randomly and weigh them, and I added to that sample the heaviest person I can find on the planet. All right? So you call up hospitals and see, all right, the heaviest person you can find. How much of the total that person represent? Barely any. Okay. So our weight. So you can have outliers, but it's not going to make a big consequence. Or let's talk about food. Okay. Tonight you're in Boston. You're going to go overeat, eat all the lobster or whatever. How many calories can you consume in a day? 3,000, 4,000? It's nothing, because a year is what, 600,000 to a million. Depends if you're a New Yorker or not. Depends if whatever you get it. So a New Yorker, 1 million calories. A Bostonian, 800,000. So okay, so nothing. So a day, not one single day is going to make a difference. So not one observation will make a big difference. But now there are environments where that rule doesn't hold. The first one is everything you study in business school, the models, standard deviation, all that is made for that environment. I call it Mediocristan. The bell curve, the Gauss curve, this, that, econometrics, regression, correlation, correlation, all that domain. The second domain, I call it Extremistan, the same thought experiment, 1,000 people, and you add to that sample the wealthiest person you can find on the planet, as of today. I mean, the market has opened, yes. So we can, because it changes, all right? So the wealthiest person, how much, again, randomly selected 1,000 people from the planet, how much of the total wealth would that person represent? Not weight, wealth. So what, you have 265 billion versus what, an average of 200,000 maybe, or not even, maybe, depends if you have too many people from whatever. So you have a concentration. So the domain that delivers this, some domain are concentrated. That person is wealthier than the bottom 2 billion, right? So the same for book sales have that effect. What else has it? You have millions of novels, maybe 10 novels sold more than the remaining 999, whatever, okay. Stock market, the stock, 100,000 companies join the market. Most of the return over a century long run come from 0.2%. But look at the S&P 500. Sometimes 100 stocks represent half the world, the US capitalization. Sometimes 300 stocks, sometimes 30. In the 80s, sometimes 30 companies with half the capitalization of the country. It was all these, or technology is worse, is the most fat tail. 25,000 companies were selling software in the 90s. One of the 25,000 had more than half the sales. Just to give you an idea of the kind of the environment. So that environment has its rules, and you want to be protected from these big deviations. Pandemics, by the way, and wars are the fattest tails. And I did, right before COVID, the paper in Nature Physics on the properties of pandemics. So say the fattest tail, pandemics, because if you look at how many diseases we've had in history, some of them have killed a large proportion of the population.
So going back to, so if you have these fat tails, are there lessons for some of the bigger companies in the audience of how to take advantage or how to respond or to build?
Yes, so when you're in an environment, so it's simple, if you go to work as a butcher, okay, or if you go to work as an artisan, you have this predictable income. You have this, but if you are in a world that has these properties, like for example, if you go into technology, all right, Google has what proportion of the internet traffic. So it's going to be hit or miss for you, and it's going to be either going to be monstrously rich, okay, or living in the basement of your grandmother, something like that. I mean, the kind of payoff is going to be very extreme in that domain. Same for companies, for sales, for everything. You have to know about it. Maybe you want to play the game, okay? You want to play the game. So in Antifragile, I talk about the barbell. To be robust, you spend, if you're an extremistan, make sure that you have something that pays your bills, makes you alive. So the strategy, typically, I have in a stock market, I just have 10% of my investments are monstrously speculative, and 90% as little risk as I can. For an average of medium risk, it's a lot better than everything being medium risk. It's safer. So for example, that idea of having a dual strategy of extreme risk on one side and backed up by extreme safety on the other, not the middle. For example, it may be optimal.
So does that answer everyone's questions around how to be anti-fragile as a big company? One question we talked about last night too was the ability for systems to learn, or people to learn, organisms to learn, or maybe not having the ability to learn from different shocks in the system. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because there is sort of the PSG, the post-traumatic
okay. So for example,
growth opportunity, but then how do you learn and continue that?
Okay, so this is going to be not good news in many respects for the following. Take the restaurant business. The restaurant business is the most, was very, till COVID, the most viable business. We did not have a bailout of restaurants in America, right? It is, so. But the problem is the restaurant business doesn't learn because chefs buy a book and and learn from that book. It learns via bankruptcy. That's the idea, that systems learn by filtering, by evolution, and that is, so the system, the restaurant, so food in New York is vastly better than food in Soviet Russia. Okay, I don't know if you've been to Soviet Russia. Okay, or post-Soviet Russia, you can compare. Why? Because you have the system in New York learns to make good food via competition. It's what we call scale transformation. So you need the bankruptcy of the restaurant to improve that as a system. Likewise in technology, you need the bankruptcy of the companies for the system to work. But the thing is, for you guys involved in technology individually, the idea is to fail early. You don't want to fail late. And it's healthier to fail early. And this is why we never had a bailout of technology in America. We have bailouts of banks, of companies that don't have this structure.
So as we think about second order effects, we talked about the supply chain, and
yes.
If you are small organizations, or if you can be nimble and anti-fragile, if you can be that mouse, you can react more quickly, but it's all tied together. Can you put this in the context of larger economies, and specifically related to manufacturing and supply chain, how you can sort of anticipate events and how they cascade, or if you can?
Okay, so let me get to it via globalization. Mm-hmm. All right, so people don't quite realize that the term globalization is meaningless, it's ill-defined. Okay, There are definitely comparative gains from trade for some countries to produce wine and others to produce apple juice, okay? So, and it makes no sense to have salmon in Saudi Arabia to produce salmon in Saudi Arabia or to produce camels in Norway, all right? So it makes no sense. So and plus there's this cross-breeding of ideas that happens, and often people you have in New Hampshire criticizing globalization using what? Twitter. So it is ill-defined for the following reason. Some, on one side you have autarky, which means that each one lives off of her or his land and garden, and that's it, and closed systems, and no trade, okay? On the other hand, you can have completely open borders, which actually now we start to have, thanks to Zoom, because there's no visas. I don't know if they've started to have visas to be able to, get on a conference call on Zoom. But so far, the State Department doesn't know about Zoom very well. I mean, doesn't know about it, so you don't need visas to get on Zoom. So we may have open borders in cyberspace. But anyway, but physically, we don't have. So when people are pro or against globalization, it's a matter of degree. Someone a little more than others. It's a matter of degree, somewhere in there. Okay, so, but some of the ills of globalization, poorly done, is when you buy everything from one supplier. Okay, everybody buys everything from one supplier. Before the recent wave of globalization that started in the 90s, okay, you used to have people making something, the product in Arkansas. You can even probably buy it in Florida and Argentina and stuff. And then progressively, that unit will be made where, all right, in one, even in one factory of that place, okay? So we'll start depending more and more on that particular country, and within that country on a particular district. So if the boats cannot get to that country, it can happen. As if you've seen the news today, there's some country that has a lot of, or actually you showed it, boats, that can't load merchandise, so the whole thing stops, okay? So that is one fragility that comes with globalization. Now remember, it's the same process that got 1 billion people or 2 billion people, depending on who you listen to, out of poverty. So it's not like it's a bad process. You just have to make sure that you reduce your fragility, okay? Find your fragilities and reduce them. That's what the situation is. Globalization is, been going on since ancient times. This is why we had the Silk Road. It bankrupted Rome. Okay, well, I don't know if it's good news or bad news, but it bankrupted Rome because they got all their, they got silk, and they bankrupted them. But at the same time, they have this. I'm sure that if you go to MIT, you walk around, you will see a lot of variations in first names. No, it's not kind of old. You see, you have a lot of countries represented. This is globalization. Okay, we're basically cross-fertilization of ideas. So it is. So let's not. But people are imprecise when they talk about globalization. I was actually sitting on a panel like this, and what I figured out that people had different definitions of globalization. There was a Russian Minister of Trade or Commerce, something like that, who spoke. He said, "I'm going to speak in Russian because of globalization." For him, globalization means everybody should speak Russian. And then there was a French Prime Minister, Fillon, who was then ex-Prime Minister, who said, it's globalization, therefore I'm going to speak in English. I'm a Frenchman, I'm going to speak in English. So you can interpret it the way you want. The idea is, let's figure out what it means and the side effect, namely supply chain shortages, which apparently, if they can make this beautiful Black Swan, or they make so many different objects, we have an insurance policy visibly against shortages, maybe progressively. Plus, it's good to have shortages. Why is it good to have shortages? Because it forces us to substitute, to find substitution, to do things, to think out of the box, just like the errors that make the system gain from it.
That's great. All right. Well, thank you for sharing your philosophy behind your numerous books. And I'm sure many people have questions here, but we can find you during the break and pepper you with those. We have a short break coming up now, and we'll reconvene at 11. Is that correct? Okay. 11 o'clock back here with Carl Bass.
Great. Thank you very much. It's really an honor to be here.